Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Every great story begins with a journey, and today's guest has spent his life uncovering the journey of millions. We are honored to welcome Dr. Zhongping Chen to Business Talk. Long before he became one of Canada's most respected historians, a young scholar in China was asking questions that most people weren't. Growing up and studying in China, Dr. Zhongping Chen earned his BA and MA from Nanjing University, where his early research into the history of the lower Yangtze cities and towns the attention of an entire nation. In 1987, China's State Commission for Education recognized his brilliance with the prestigious Social Science Award for Young Scholars, a signal that this was the mind destined to go for. And go far he did. An East-West Center fellowship took him across the Pacific to the University of Hawaii, where he earned his PhD in 1998. He then shaped young minds at McGill University and Trent University before finding his academic home at the University of Victoria in 2002, where he serves today as a professor of history, building a career at the crossroads of Chinese socio-economic history, diaspora studies, and environmental history. But what truly sets Dr. Chung apart is the scale of his vision. His scholarship spans 6 centuries, from the sweeping socio-political transformations of late imperial and republican China to the deeply human stories of Chinese migrants who cross oceans in a search of a better life across North America and the broader Pacific world. A prolific author with Stanford University Press and Brill, his landmark book Transpacific Reform and Revolution has already reshaped how we understand this era. And now he arrives with what may be his most ambitious work yet, the Transpacific Chinese Diaspora, Migration Networks from China to Canada and Beyond, 1788 to 1898, from Stanford University Press, published in 2026. He has also led major federally funded research initiatives, including a celebrated digital heritage project on Victoria's historic Chinatown, bringing forgotten histories back to life for future generations. At its heart, Professor Chun's life work does something rare and remarkable. It bridges the local and the global, revealing how the movement of merchants, reformers, laborers, and revolutionaries didn't just shape Chinese society. They wove the very multicultural fabric of the modern world. In today's episode, Professor Zhongping Chen shares key insights from his fascinating book, The Transpacific Chinese Diaspora, a story of migration, resilience, and the invisible threads that connect continents across centuries. Let's not keep you waiting. Professor Zhongping Chen, it's a truly privilege to have you here. Welcome to Business Talk.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Professor, your book traces the Chinese diaspora in Canada all the way back to 1788, decades before the gold rushes and the railway. Who were these early Chinese migrants and what brought them to the Pacific shores of Canada at a time when almost nobody was talking about them?
This is a very good question. Previous studies of the Chinese in North America often started from the California Gold Rushes, starting in 1848 and thereafter. But my book starts from the Chinese migrants' engagement in British and American fur trade in 1788 and 1789. These Chinese pioneer migrants were Cantonese-speaking people from Guangdong province near the Portuguese colony of Macau at that time, or near today's Hong Kong. They came to the Pacific Northwest of North America as laborers for British and American merchants in fur trade. However, they also used the nearby Portuguese colony for the Trans-Pacific ventures because the government of Qing China at that time banned the overseas immigration. So thus they used Macau not only as a stone, but also for protection from the state-imposed law against the overseas immigration in China itself. So thus the Cantonese led Chinese migration to the Americas was not only a transnational movement, but also cross-cultural ventures because it used Western colonies and Western commercial and colonial expansion for their Trans-Pacific migration from the beginning.
Professor, you specifically focus on the Cantonese dominated diaspora. Why were the Cantonese at the center of this Trans-Pacific movement? What was it about their geography, culture, or networks that made them the driving force of Chinese migration to Canada?
The Chinese are the major residents in the province of Guangdong, north of Macau and Hong Kong. And the province is on the south coast of China. But the Chinese migrants covered by my book were not the people from the whole Guangdong province, but they actually came from about 10 districts or about 10 counties near Macau and Hong Kong. Together with a small group of another ethnic group of people called Hakka or the guest people in Guangdong. So these Cantonese migrants from about the 10 districts basically dominated the early Chinese migration and communities in North America, South America, Hawaii, and Australia by the 1950s. So that's my book basically tries to answer the question, why the Cantonese from such a small area of 10 districts dominate the Chinese migration and communities in the New World, in the Americas, including Canada and the United States. And my answer is that they use not only their kinship and local fellowship for Chan migration, but also use the Western commercial and colonial expansion, including European colonies of Macau and Hong Kong, to build transnational and cross-cultural networks for Trans-Pacific migration. Yeah.
Professor, one of the most compelling aspects of your research is the use of previously untapped archival records, including the records of secret societies. What did you find in those archives that completely change or challenge the conventional narrative of Chinese migration history?
Okay, so for writing this book, I was actually lucky because I found three major kinds of archive collections in British Columbia. First is the collection of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association in Victoria. So this has been the umbrella community organization in the Chinatown of Victoria in Western Canada from 1884 in the city I'm living. So this organization started from 1884 and it not only kept its records systematically from 1884 until today, but also opened its records to the scholar and general public for research. Similar community organizations in other Canadian and American cities, such as the one in San Francisco, they do not have the records from the beginning. For example, the San Francisco's the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association had the records only from 1906 up to the San Francisco earthquake, because the earthquake destroyed all its records before 1906. And also, they do not open their records to the public for research. So the second kind of archive collection is the records of the Chinese Home Fraternal Society, or what we usually call a Triad Society. But its a former English title actually is the Chinese Freemasons. So this was originally a secret society. So most of its chapters in Canada and United States do not open their records to the public. But I found the rich records from its branches from the ghost towns in British Columbia. The third kind of archive collection is my discovery of court documents from the earliest and also largest Chinese company in Canada called Conley Company that started from Victoria in 1858. So all these archive records challenge our previous knowledge about the Chinese migration history. First, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association actually molded itself up to charitable organizations in the West. And they adopt Western organizational principles such as periodic election and registration with local governments and so on. So it actually was it adopted Western culture from its beginning. Second, the Triad Society or the Chinese Freemasons was not the Chinese mafia or the Chinese criminal organization as Western media described it, but it actually was a secret community organization for most poor Chinese migrants. Back to 1898, almost 80% of Chinese migrants were members of this organization or this fraternal organization. It did involve in opium trafficking and gambling and other activities that gave them bad reputation. But these activities were legal in Canada at that time, and some of them are still legal today, like casinos, right? And the third, the archives from the Coney Company showed the organized Chinese migration to Canada because this company helped bring thousands of Chinese migrants to the United States from the 1850s and then to Canada between 1858 and 1880. Yeah.
Professor, your book features the first intensive examination of Chinese migrants' engagement in the Trans-Pacific Anglo-American fur trade, a story almost no one knows. Can you walk us through that connection? How did Chinese merchants and laborers fit into this vast trading world?
Okay, so the book actually starts from the stories about how three larger groups of Cantonese migrants joined the British and American merchants in the fur trade in the Pacific Northwest of both Canada and the United States in 1788 and 1789. The supply of food trade, the supply of food from sea otters on the west coast of today's Canada was discovered first by the fleet of Captain James Cook during his famous third voyage to the Pacific in 1778. So we knew Captain Cook died in clash with the indigenous people on Hawaii Island and so on, but his fleet sailed to China, and they discovered the larger market for sea otter food there. So the first group of Chinese merchant, Cantonese migrants were recruited by a British captain, John Mears, from the place near Macau in 1788. Captain John Mears first brought European sailors to the Pacific Northwest for fur trade in 1776 and 1786 and 87, but most of his sailors were perished in the cold weather of Alaska or lost in the sea. So he had to recruit the first 50 Cantonese sailors to the Pacific Northwest in 1788. So he also tried to use them to establish the British colony to on today's west coast of Canada, because at that time it was very hard for the people from England to move to today's West Canada. So because he felt so happy with the work of the first group of 50 Chinese Cantonese migrants, he went back to Macau and recruited 70 more Cantonese migrants to the Pacific Northwest in 1789. In 1789, one American captain, Simon Markov, also brought 45 Cantonese migrants for fur trade in the Pacific Northwest. However, at that time, the Spanish colonial authorities in today's Mexico claimed that the whole west coast of North America belonged to Spain. So the Spanish warship captured the British and Cantonese sailors and sent them to Mexico. So at that time, Britain was ready to launch a war against Spain for the issue because one major ally of Spain, France, fell into the French Revolution in 1789. The Spanish government had to make a concession to Britain. So that is why British government sent George Vancouver to today's British Columbia, and that started the British colonization in today's Western Canada. So all the captured Cantonese migrants were released back to China, but at least one or two of them stayed in Hawaii, and they started Chinese migration to Hawaii Islands from 1789.
Professor, from the California Gold Rush to British Columbia and then the Canadian Pacific Railway, it feels like each wave of migration was triggered by the one before it. How did these economic events create a chain of migration, and how did Chinese migrants adapt their networks each time?
Okay, so the Chinese used the kingship, local fellowship, and other connections to build networks for transpacific migration during the gold rushes and the railway construction. But they also constructed transnational and cross-cultural networks with white people and indigenous people for migration. For example, the Conley Company, the first and also the largest Chinese company in Western Canada, starting from 1858. Its founders originally actually had one American businessman called John Palmer as a business partner. So they together brought thousands of Chinese migrants to the United States and to Canada. So for Chinese labor contracts of the Canadian Pacific Railway that was built between 1880 and 1885. So the Chinese labor contractors worked closely with the white contractor of the railway and also with the Western shipping companies to recruit, to transport the Chinese railway works first from the United States to Canada and then from Hong Kong to Canada between 1880 and 1885. After the American government imposed the Chinese Exclusion Act to ban the labor immigration into the United States in 1882, the British Columbia government twice tried to follow the American example and passed similar laws to prohibit the Chinese labor immigration into the Canadian province in 1884 and again in 1885. But the white contractors of the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Canadian government had to use the cheap Chinese laborers to build the railway. So thus, the Chinese labor contractors used the white contractor of the railway to influence the Canadian government and then met the federal government in Ottawa twice. This allowed the British Columbia government's law against the Chinese immigration in 1884 and 1885. So as a result, they used these cross-cultural networks with white contractor and even with the Canadian government to bring in nearly about 10,000 Chinese laborers for the railway construction and also helped a total of 20,000 Chinese immigrants, including the railway works, to enter Canada in the 5 years of railway construction from 1880 and 1885. Yeah.
Professor, your work highlights something rarely explored: the cross cultural interactions between Chinese migrants and indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. What did those relationships look like? And what does that history reveal that a purely nation state framework of history would miss?
Uh, The earliest Cantonese migrants joined the British and American merchants in fur trade in the Pacific Northwest in 1788 and 1789, and they had only limited contacts with the indigenous people. For example, they worked with the indigenous people on Notuk Island on the west coast of today's Vancouver Island. And they together built a two-story building for the fur trade of the British Captain Zhongping Chen. And however, during the gold rushes in British Columbia, they had more contact with each other because white gold miners normally they would rush from one gold mine field to another rich one and abandon or sold their old diggings to Chinese migrants. So thus, the Chinese migrants and indigenous people could work together in the old gold miner fields left by the white gold miners. In my book, it tells a story about how four Chinese and one indigenous miner worked together in 1862, and they actually lived together in the same log cabin left by white miners, but they died together during an avalanche under the massive snow, and unfortunately. So in another case, a small Chinese merchant specifically sold goods to indigenous communities and even married one indigenous woman. So during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, my book shows that not only more than 10,000 Chinese built the railway, thousands of white workers, together with hundreds of indigenous people, also worked with the Chinese on the same construction site. So more and more Chinese migrants even married with an indigenous woman in British Columbia. Yeah.
Professor, Chinese migrants in this era face brutal racism and settler colonialism, yet they build lasting community institutions. How did they use constitutionalism and legal framework, tools of the very system that excluded them, to protect and reform their communities?
Okay, so in the Chinatowns from San Francisco to Victoria, so they followed the example of Western charitable organizations to establish the Chinese Consultative Benevolent Association, which also allowed followed Western organizational principles such as periodical meetings and competitive election of leaders, as I said. So these Chinatown organizations rallied the Chinese migrants to fight against racial discrimination. My book shows how the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association in Victoria raised funds from all the Chinese migrants in Canada, hired white lawyers, and launched a legal battle against a special $10 tax on each Chinese migrants by the British Columbia government in 1884. So they actually took the British Columbia government to the Supreme Court of British Columbia in 1884, and finally actually won the court battle. In particular, in 1884, the Canadian government appointed a royal commission to investigate the Chinese migration issue, starting from California to British Columbia. Uh, so they actually would use the report from the royal commission to decide whether Canada should follow the Chinese Exclusion Act of the United States or follow the head tax policy on Chinese immigrants in Australia. So the Chinese General Consulate in San Francisco worked together with the Chinese community leaders in Victoria. They worked together, they actually provide the information to the Royal Commission, but all the information was favorable to the Chinese. So that actually influenced the Royal Commission report. Finally, the Canadian government imposed the head tax on Chinese immigrants, did not adopt the Chinese Exclusion Act from the United States. So my book shows that the Chinese migration to Canada continued to continue, and the Chinese community continuously expand. Even the head tax was imposed from 1885, but the number of Chinese migrants in the United States decreased after the imposition of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So you can see a big difference how the Chinese used the Canadian institution and to fight for their own interests. Yeah.
Professor, you examine community reforms across North American Chinatowns as a significant historical force. How did Chinatowns in Canada and the United States influence each other? And in what ways did those reforms ripple all the way back to Queen China?
The Chinatown reforms started from San Francisco and then to New York, Portland, Victoria in Canada. So they were mainly influenced by the Chinese consul general in San Francisco called Zhongping Chen. Zhongping Chen was the consul general in San Francisco from 1882 to 1885. The key to the Chinatown reforms was to establish the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Associations as the Western style and self-government organizations for fight against the racial discrimination and also against the internal vices, such as like prostitution and gangsters in the Chinese community. So Foundation later went back to China under the Qing government, and he became an official in Hunan province in central China in 1897. And he basically formed the local reforms organization in Hunan province, similar to the community organization in North American Chinatowns, and tried to start the bottom-up reforms from the local level to the national level, and finally establish a constitutional monarchy on the basis of the self-government at the local level. So this led to the first national level political reform of China, Qing China in 1808. So, but this reform was short. After this national level reform failed, its major leader, called Conway, and he came to Victoria as a political exile in 1899. And then he used the leaders of the Chinese Freemasons and the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association in Victoria to launch the overseas Chinese political reforms from Victoria and tried to form a constitutional government in China and also protect overseas Chinese migrants from racial discrimination. So his organization, his reformed organization, starting from Victoria, was called the Chinese Empire Reform Association. And it started from Victoria in 1899 and then developed more than 200 branches in the Chinese communities in North America, South America, Asia, Australia, and even Africa. So my previous work, Transpacific Reform and Revolution, mainly discussed how this Victoria originated reforms organization influenced politics in China and Chinese communities in the political realm. But this, political influence really we can trace it back to the earlier period, as my new book discussed. Yeah.
Professor, a central argument of your book is that we need to go beyond Chinese Canadian and Chinese American studies as separate national frameworks. Why has that nation state lens limited our understanding of this history? And what does a truly trans Pacific, transnational lens reveal about that was invisible before?
So the Cantonese engagement in the fur trade in the Pacific Northwest in 1788 and 1789 was a beginning of Chinese Canadian history, right? But it was also the origin of Chinese migration to the United States, Mexico, and South America, because most Chinese immigrants to these North American, South American countries were Cantonese. Uh, before 1957. But the Canada's migration to the Americas really started from their arrival in the western coast of today's Canada in 1788, 89. So on the other hand, the Chinese migration to Canada during the gold rushes actually started from Chinese move from California to British Columbia in 1858. During the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway from 1880 to 1885, the earliest Chinese works originally actually worked on the Central Pacific Railroad, the North Pacific Railroad, and the South Pacific Railroad in the United States. And later, they entered Canada to build the railway. And certainly later, more Chinese came from China to Canada for the railway construction. So if we discuss the Chinese Canadian history only in the context of Canada, or the Chinese American history only in the context of the United States, we cannot tell the whole story, about the origin, about the development, right? So thus we needed to take the transnational approach to the Chinese diaspora in North America, or even in the Trans-Pacific context, to tell the more comprehensive history, because diaspora refers to migrants' relations with the homeland, hostland, and co-ethnic communities across the world. Yeah.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. The story of the Chinese diaspora in the 19th century, migration networks, cross-cultural identity, exclusion, and resilience, feels remarkably alive in today's world. What do you hope readers, policymakers, and even business leaders take away from this history as they navigate an increasingly interconnected and divided world?
So I just want to make two simple points. First, for the mainstream societies in either Canada or the United States, the Chinese migrants were not aliens, not just sojourners. They actually developed the transnational and cross-cultural networks with the mainstream society of either Canada or the United States from the very beginning. Second, for scholar and the public in China, I will stress the Chinese migrants were not the marginal people in Chinese history. They actually played an essential role in Chinese history. Yeah.
Listeners, and on that note, we come to the end of a truly enlightening conversation. Professor Zhongping Chen, thank you for bringing this remarkable history to life. The stories of migration, resilience, and identity that your work uncovers are as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. To our listeners, do pick up the Transpacific Chinese Diaspora, published by Stanford University Press. It is a book well worth your time. Professor Chung, it has been an absolute privilege to hosting you. Thank you to joining on Business Talk.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.